So we talked about the crash previously. Now we're going to talk about the Depression and the New Deal and the responses from the government following the crash. So how bad was it? Well, to put things in perspective, have you ever been kissed by a Dementor? Something similar back in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Economically, it was really bad. So here it just shows the gross domestic product of the country. So this is think of this as the total production of the economy, or you can think of this as the income of the nation. And we see that from 1929 to 1933, it drops dramatically. Very large decreases. The economy is getting smaller. People's incomes are getting smaller. 25% of America is out of work. People who are along the farms are out of farming. Just a dramatic, really bad situation across the board. And there's really horrific stories of the poverty and the challenges that people faced during this time. A book that I was required to read in high school, maybe you did as well, Grapes of Wrath. Again, it goes through and shows the challenges that families faced during this time. It was bad for individuals. It was bad for the economy. And it got worse. So the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was passed as a way to try to protect American businesses. So Reed Smoot was from the state of Utah, a senator, and Hawley was from the House of Representatives from Oregon. So they got together, they passed these tariffs, and the design of these tariffs were to tax imported goods from other countries, therefore encouraging people to buy goods produced in America. The problem and challenge with tariffs is that they raise the cost of goods. So it's more expensive to produce certain things in the United States than it is to produce them abroad and import them in. So this raised the price of goods that consumers were trying to buy. And this meant they didn't buy those goods anymore. And so it did not effectually help American companies during this time. The other thing that it did is when the United States placed tariffs on other countries, they responded with placing tariffs on the United States. And this became a great challenge, especially with our relationships with Canada, because we were exporting more things to Canada than they were importing to the United States. And so all of those American producers that were selling abroad no longer had that market to sell abroad. And so it really hurt American industries. And this is one of the arguments against tariffs, is because tariffs lead to these trade wars where countries place tariffs upon each other, and it hurts businesses in both countries and it hurts the people in both countries. And the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was one of these things. It dramatically decreased international trade throughout the world. That now, as these tariffs increased, countries were not trading with each other. This became very challenging for Germany and Austria in the sense that they were repaying debts that they owed from World War I. Because they couldn't produce goods and sell them to the United States, it devastated their economy. Eventually, their banks had a major bank failure throughout the country, and the nation turned to a new leader. And that's where the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler, rises to power, is after these major bank failures that came as really a result of these trade wars instigated by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Acts. And so this did not lead to the Great Depression, but it certainly exacerbated the devastation of the Great Depression. And so the current president, Herbert Hoover, when he was running for office in 1928, he said, we're going to end poverty for good. And that didn't happen. And Herbert Hoover followed what we call Austrian economics. This is the free market economics. And the argument here is government could intervene in the markets and try to do things to promote and encourage the economy, but that just takes so long. As a result, it is better for the economies to let them correct themselves and let them go through these processes of recessions and then build back naturally to have a better and stronger economy. And so Hoover adopted this Austrian point of view in terms of letting the markets correct themselves. Yes, we're going to enter into a depression. We're going to enter into a recession first and then a depression. But that's okay because the markets will address it and will come out even stronger on the back end. This was not shared by most Americans. Most Americans supported this new individual, the former governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He did not run on the campaign of the New Deal. What's very interesting is when he is called to, when he does his acceptance speech of the nomination. He says, I pledge to you, I pledge to myself to a new deal for the American people. This is more than a political campaign, it is a call to arms. Hoover very widely gets elected to be president, and once he wins the nomination, he then starts this notion of a New Deal. And that's because Roosevelt's economic views were aligned with a British economist at the time named John Maynard Keynes. And this is what we call Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics is the opposite, or is different than Austrian economics. Keynesian economics says that there is a role for government intervention during times of crises. During recessions, the government can take proactive steps that will shorten the time to recovery. And that's the viewpoint that Franklin Delano Roosevelt adopted with one of his lead economists, John Maynard Keynes. And so when we talk about Keynesian economics, it's this equation here, aggregate demand. This is based off of the gross domestic product. The aggregate demand is equal to the amount of consumption happening in the country, the amount of investment, the amount of government spending, and the net exports, or exports minus imports. And so what John Maynard Keynes argued is consumption is what drives the economy. But if consumption drops, if investment drops, then government spending can increase, and that will increase the aggregate demand, which will get the country back on track. And so he very much promoted government spending during times of crises to get the economy back on track. And FDR adopted that policy. And so we talk about the different components of this. The components is consumption. Consumption is the biggest component, and it really drives the issue of GDP within a country. And so the focus oftentimes is try to increase consumption because that is the biggest impact factor in GDP. And one way that you can affect aggregate demand is to try to use monetary policy. And so when you're on the gold standard as a country, you can't actually adopt monetary policy because the way to increase the amount of money in the economy is to actually find more gold or discover more gold. And so this time period, the United States goes off of the gold standard, and that allows them to have more free monetary policy, meaning they can print money. Now the downside is they might print too much money. But at this time, they begin to use monetary policy, what we call expansionary monetary policy, to print more money, increase the money supply, decrease this by having more money, it actually brings down the interest rates, and that leads companies and businesses to try to invest more money. As a result, this increases production. When companies try to invest more money, they can then hire more workers, they pay more workers, workers have money to increase consumption, it further increases GDP and aggregate demand. So that's the idea of Keynesian economics with using monetary policy. And so that's what Roosevelt adopted. He adopted this Keynesian economics, the government's going to get involved, and they get involved in three major ways. Roosevelt called it relief, recovery, and reform. And so a lot of the government policies, whether it be the CCR or this or that, was to focus on these three things. Now we talk about what did the New Deal accomplish. Now there's a lot of debate about whether things are good or bad. Does Keynesian economics work? Does it not work? But three things came out of this that really established long-lasting impacts throughout our country. The first is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is the FDIC. You hear this at the end of every banking commercial, FDIC insured. What this does is the federal government would insure deposits made in banks. So anytime someone put money into the bank and that bank went out of business, the federal government would pay you back the amount you had in the bank. This builds confidence in the banking system. We'll jump down to the third one, the Federal Reserve Reform and Control and Monetary Policy. The Bank Act of 1935 really started to establish the strength of the banking system in the United States. The start of the Great Depression and these bank failures really created these credit constraints, so companies couldn't borrow money. And so these two, the FDIC and the Bank Act of 1935, established trust in the banking system and established a regulated banking system to ensure that we wouldn't have bank failures. And it turns out we've not had a major bank failure since the passage of these two laws. The second is Social Security. And Social Security is something we see today. And so let's talk about what Social Security. It was done at the time to provide assistance to the elderly who didn't have the ability to return to work and that were very destitute. And so the way that Social Security works is it's a pay-as-you-go system. So as you work, you pay a certain percentage of your income to the government. The government takes that income and they don't invest it, but they give it to the old people in that generation at that time. And the reason why this works is we get a lot of people working. and they contribute small amounts, and it goes to very few people who are old. And in the 1930s, this was good because there weren't a lot of old people. People didn't live as long. But what we start to see as we've progressed as a nation from the 1930s is there's just a lot more old people. Not only are they more people are living to the age of 65, but they're also living much longer. Life expectancy has increased. That means the payments for Social Security continue to expand, which increases the cost. Furthermore is, well, we had the baby boom. That was fantastic after World War II. A lot of workers, and they contribute to that system. But now the baby boom means there's even more people who are old. It's not just people who are living longer, but there's more of them, and there's fewer younger workers. And so this is the challenge. When people say Social Security won't be there when I'm old, most likely it'll still be there. It might be in a different form. But the challenge with it is because fewer people are working and there's more people receiving benefits, then there needs to be some way to balance the system out. And so there's different policies that can be done to fix the problem. The first is to change the tax rate. Currently, the tax rate is 6.2%. So you pay 6.2% in taxes up to a certain amount every paycheck that goes towards your grandma and grandpa's retirement right now. There are times when they've decreased this, and one way you can fix the problem is just increase the tax rate, increase the amount that each person is contributing. A second thing you can do to fix Social Security is change retirement age. There's different retirement age, but at 66, for those who are born after 1960, used to be able to get full benefits, but now it's 67. Furthermore, is one way to change this is just increase that to 72. People are living longer, they're healthier longer. And so say you can't receive your benefits until you're 72, and so people will continue to work, and that's another way to fix the problem. The other is on you guys, is just to have a lot more babies. Is each of you were to dedicate yourselves to have 10 to 15 children, that would solve the problem within your generation, because your 10 to 15 children would be the workers that are working while you retire. So it's up to you guys. Different policies we can adopt, or you can use the private solution to solve the Social Security issue. So what did you learn from the Great Recession? This is an important question for you to think about. As you read the chapter, as you work on the assignments, what did you learn from the Great Recession? Because as we go into what happened in the great housing crisis of 2008, as we look to see what's currently happening right now with the COVID-19 economic crisis, the lessons from the Great Depression are what's going to inform policy today. And that's why it's so important that we talk about the Great Depression and what we learned to help inform us to know how should we respond in these other two economic crises. So we're going to come back and revisit what did we learn when we talk about the Great Recession of 2008, the housing crisis, and COVID-19.